Today, we're diving into the story of French Indochina, a massive colonial territory that once sprawled across a huge chunk of Southeast Asia. We're going to see how it was built, how it was run, and ultimately, how it all came apart. So here's the big question. How did the lands we now know as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos end up being bundled together under French rule for nearly 100 years? Let's get into it. First things first, let's get a sense of the scale here. French Indochina was enormous. We're talking about a territory with incredibly diverse landscapes, everything from dense tropical jungles to massive, fertile river deltas. And slicing right through the heart of it all was the mighty Mekong River, truly the lifeblood of the entire region. So where did this whole thing even come from? Well, the story doesn't start with an invasion. It actually begins centuries before the colony was officially formed, with just a handful of ships. You see, French involvement wasn't some overnight event. It started quietly, way back in the 1600s. You had missionaries and traders arriving, looking for people to convert, and of course, new things to trade. This was really just the first small step in a much, much longer process. For the next couple hundred years, French influence just kept growing, bit by bit. But then, in the mid-1800s, things really kicked into high gear. In 1859, the French military captured the super important city of Saigon. That was a huge turning point. And by 1887, they made it official, creating the Union of Indochina and putting all their territories in the region under one single government. Okay, so you've got this huge, diverse territory. How do you possibly run it? Well, the French came up with a very strict, top-down system. Think of it like a pyramid. Right at the very top was the governor general. He was appointed back in Paris and held all the real power. Below him, you had French residents and governors who managed the different regions. Now, you might be wondering about the local kings and emperors. Well, they were allowed to keep their thrones, but their authority was almost completely symbolic. And at the ground level, it was French officials making sure everyone followed the new colonial law. This whole system relied on a really important idea called a protectorate. That was the official status for most of Indochina. On paper, it sounded like the local king was still in charge. But in reality, he was basically a figurehead. The French official was the one really pulling all the strings and making every single important decision. So there were kind of two different systems working at once. The southern part of Vietnam, called Cochinchina, was a direct colony. It was treated almost like a province of France itself. The other regions, though, were these protectorates. But here's the key thing to remember. Whether it was direct rule or a protectorate, the French always had the final say. So why go through all this trouble? The answer, for the most part, comes down to one thing: money. The colony was specifically designed to be an economic engine for the French Empire. And Indochina was absolutely packed with valuable resources. The French zeroed in on three key things. First, huge amounts of rice from the incredibly fertile Mekong Delta. Second, rubber from massive plantations, which was needed for the booming tire industry. And third, coal and other metals from mines up in the north. To get all these resources out, the French built an incredible amount of infrastructure. We're talking thousands of miles of railways and roads, creating a huge network that crisscrossed the entire territory. But it's really important to understand why all this was built. It wasn't primarily to help the local people get around. No, it was all designed to make the colonial machine run smoother, to get resources to the ports, and to move troops to any trouble spots as fast as possible. So where did all that wealth actually end up? Well, the vast majority of the profits went straight into the pockets of French companies and investors back in Europe. A tiny fraction of it was ever put back into local communities or paid to the workers who were actually producing it all. An economic system like this, well, it created a society with some deep divisions. For the French and for the local population, it was almost like they were living in two completely separate worlds. In the big colonial capitals like Hanoi and Saigon, the French basically tried to recreate a little piece of home. They built these stunning, grand opera houses, wide, tree-lined boulevards, and huge cathedrals that would look right at home in Paris. But step just outside these European-style city centers, and life was totally different. The vast majority of Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians were still living in rural villages pretty much the same way they had for centuries, and they were kept socially and legally separate from the French colonists. You can see this separation so clearly when you look at education. Sure, a French-style school system was set up, but it was mostly for French kids and a tiny, hand-picked group of locals who were being trained for low-level government jobs. For most people, especially out in the countryside, getting an education just wasn't even a possibility. The justice system was also split right down the middle. If you are a French citizen, you were subject to French law, in your own courts. But for the local population, it was this messy mix of their old traditions and brand new colonial rules, and a French judge always had the final say. Just think about what that means. A French colonist could commit a crime and face a very lenient court, while a local person accused of the exact same thing could face a much, much tougher punishment. It was a system designed to protect the rulers, not the rulers. Now, a system built on that much inequality just couldn't last forever. Opposition started to grow over time, and that eventually led to the end of the whole colonial era. Resistance started popping up in all sorts of ways. Early on, you had some members of the old royal courts who tried to push back against their loss of power. A little later, a new generation of educated nationalists began to organize, using things like newspapers and secret societies to spread ideas about independence. The really big turning point, though, was World War II. The war just completely shattered France's control over the region. After the war, independence movements exploded in strength. This led to long, brutal conflicts that eventually forced the French to leave, which finally paved the way for the independent nations we know today. But the story doesn't just stop there. The colonial period left a deep and lasting mark on the whole region. You can still see its influence everywhere, from the grand old buildings in Hanoi to French words that are still used in local languages, even to the baguettes you can buy on street corners. And that really leaves us with a final thought. This period of history wasn't just about redrawing a few maps. It totally reshaped entire economies, societies, and cultures in ways that are still being felt right now. So how do you think a century of colonial rule continues to shape Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in the 21st century? Thanks for joining me.